The hunters laughed first, but humans finished the hunt. There is an old saying among the Vreth, a species so ancient that they watched 3 suns collapse before they bothered to develop agriculture, that the galaxy belongs to the patient predator. They invented that saying, by the way. They also invented 17 different words for prey and 0 words for surrender, which tells you everything you need to know about the Vreth and absolutely nothing reassuring about being in the same galaxy as them. The Vreth did not walk. They stalked, even aboard their own ships, even down their own corridors, even when they were heading to the meal dispensary for a snack. They moved like something that fully intended to eat whatever it was about to encounter. 8 limbs, 4 for locomotion, 4 for other purposes, covered in a natural armor plating that evolution had spent 600 million years perfecting. Eyes that could track a single photon across a dark room. Olfactory organs so sensitive they could smell fear through a bulkhead. They were, in the technical scientific sense, absolutely terrifying, and in the personal experiential sense, the kind of thing you saw once in a dream and then never slept again. They had been the undisputed apex predators of the Orion Spur for 11,000 years. 11,000 years of ruling every hunting ground, every disputed territory, every frontier world that other species eyed nervously, and the Vreth simply walked into and claimed. Other species built walls. The Vreth walked through walls. Sometimes literally, because their natural plating could punch through standard construction-grade alloy without slowing down noticeably. So when the Vreth first received signals from a small, damp, unremarkable world in an unremarkable solar system, their initial response was not concern. Their initial response was curiosity, the way a predator is curious about a new kind of prey, interested in the mechanics, not particularly worried about the outcome. The Vreth High Hunter Council dispatched a scouting party, led by Commander Threk Val, a veteran of 43 planetary acquisitions and the kind of being who had a reputation that preceded him through 3 star systems. His second was Lura Sin, who had once tracked a fleeing species across 6 parsecs purely out of professional pride. The crew of the Relentless Fang, 48 Vreth, each one personally selected for excellence, descended toward the blue-green world with the casual confidence of professionals arriving at a routine job. They observed from orbit first, standard protocol. What they saw did not alarm them. The dominant species, small, bilaterally symmetrical, comically fragile, operating on a mere 2 limbs, had divided themselves into dozens of competing territorial groups that seemed to spend considerable energy fighting each other. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards. Chemical propulsion vehicles, early electromagnetic communication, weapons that functioned by accelerating small metal projectiles through controlled explosive combustion. Adorable, really. The Vreth equivalent of a sharpened stick. Threk Val watched the data feeds with something approximating amusement. They kill each other, he observed, with the tone of someone noting that a puddle of water was wet. Lura Singh clicked her mandibles in the Vreth expression of mild contempt. Inefficiently, and they argue about it afterward, at length. No natural armor, no venom, no enhanced sensory systems. Threk Val reviewed the biological report with growing disbelief. Their primary survival mechanism appears to be tools and persistence. The ship's xenobiologist, Drevon, added this quietly, reviewing a secondary data stream that the others hadn't looked at closely yet. Commander, their archaeological record suggests these creatures have been hunting since before they developed language, and their prey, he paused, were significantly larger than them. Everything is larger than them, Lura Sin said. That is not impressive. Their prey were larger than us, Drevon said. A brief silence settled over the command deck. Then Threk Val made the sound that Vreth make when they are dismissing something as irrelevant. A low, resonant rumble that meant, essentially, noted and disregarded. He had not survived 43 planetary acquisitions by worrying about biological reports from primitive worlds. He had survived by being larger, faster, and more lethal than anything that objected to his presence. We make contact, he said. Standard intimidation protocol. Let them understand what we are. This was where the Vreth made their first mistake. Not their last, but definitely the one that set the tone. Standard intimidation protocol, when the Vreth used it on other species, was extremely effective. The Vreth would land their ship, a vessel the size of a city block, designed to look like exactly what it was, and emerge in full display, plating fully extended, pheromones engaged to broadcast apex predator status on every biological frequency. All 8 limbs spread to maximize apparent size. The low-frequency vibration that most prey species registered as existential dread activated at full power. The response from most species was immediate and entirely reasonable. Capitulation, prostration, or in some memorable cases, spontaneous cardiac events. The response from the humans of a small settlement in a region they called Montana was Corporal Yuwande Ose Mensa leaning out of a guard post and shouting, "Haruto, get the lieutenant and grab the camera. You are not going to believe this." Private Haruto Shinzato, to his eternal credit, did both of these things simultaneously, which required impressive coordination. Lieutenant Priya Mathur arrived 45 seconds later, slightly out of breath, and stood in front of Threk Val, a being that outmassed her by a factor of 12, that smelled of predator so strongly that every animal within 2 kilometers had fled, that was currently displaying in a way that was scientifically calibrated to trigger panic responses in any biological entity. And she looked up at him with an expression that Threk Val had genuinely never encountered before. Calculation, not fear, not awe, not the frozen paralysis of prey caught in the open. She looked at him the way a professional looks at a problem that is interesting, but probably solvable. "Sergeant Kowalczyk," she said, without taking her eyes off Threk Val, "get me Dr. Ferris on the line. And someone start recording everything. This is first contact, people. Act like it." She looked back at Threk Val. "I don't suppose you speak English." Threk Val, who had a translation matrix that had been running since before they landed, said, in perfect, if slightly rumbled, English, "You do not display fear, should I?" Priya asked. "Yes," Threk Val said, with complete sincerity. "Significantly." She seemed to consider this. "Are you hostile?" "We are Vreth. I'll take that as undecided." She turned and said something rapidly to Kowalczyk that the translation matrix rendered as instructions regarding something called Protocol 7, and make sure the general knows before CNN does, for the love of God. Threk Val turned to Laura Sin. In Vreth, he said, low enough that he assumed the translation matrix wouldn't catch it. "Why is it not afraid?" "I don't know," Laura Sin said. Which, for a Vreth, was an admission roughly equivalent to a human confession of profound existential confusion. On the ship above, Drevon was reading his data feeds more carefully, with the growing expression of someone who has found a footnote that completely changes the meaning of the document. The humans, it turned out, had a history, not a short one. Homo sapiens had been anatomically modern for roughly 300,000 years, which was, by the standards of most technological species, an extraordinarily long time to be sharp and fragile in a world full of things that were large and dangerous. They had survived ice ages. They had survived volcanic winters. They had survived megafauna, creatures that made the Vreth's natural plating look like a mild advantage, by doing something that the Vreth's evolutionary history had never required them to do. The Vreth were fast. The Vreth were strong. The Vreth were armored and venomous and possessed of senses that no prey species could match. When a Vreth hunted, it ended quickly, because the Vreth were built to end things quickly. Humans had never been the fastest, never the strongest, never the most armored. Against the megafauna of their Pleistocene world, a lone human was a snack at best and an inconvenience at worst. But humans had discovered something in that long, hard school of survival that the Vreth, in their 11,000 years of unchallenged dominance, had never needed to learn. Endurance, not just physical endurance, though that was real. Humans had a cooling system, a sweat-based heat dissipation mechanism, so efficient that on a hot day they could literally run most other mammals to death, pursuing prey until it collapsed from heat exhaustion, while the human was still, technically fine, But more than that, cognitive endurance, emotional endurance, the deeply embedded, almost irrational human capacity to be knocked down, look at what knocked them down and start working out how to knock it back. Drevon pulled up the historical records. He looked at the contents with the expression of someone whose professional assumption has just been surgically removed and replaced with something much more uncomfortable. Humans had looked at animals the size of small buildings and decided to hunt them. Had hunted them to extinction, in many cases, not because they were stronger, but because they were relentless. Had built civilizations, watched those civilizations collapse, and built new ones on the rubble. Had invented weapons, found that other humans used those weapons against them, and invented better weapons. Had encountered diseases that killed half their population and responded by developing medicine. Had been pushed to the brink repeatedly throughout their history, and had responded each time with the same fundamental approach that Drevon was now finding increasingly difficult to categorize as primitive. They adapted, they persisted, and critically, they remembered. He opened a channel to the commander on the surface. Threk Vol, I need you to see something. But Threk Vol was, at that precise moment, watching Lieutenant Mathur receive what appeared to be a communication through a small device pressed to her ear, respond to it in clipped, efficient sentences, and then look back at him with an expression that he was starting to recognize, not because he'd seen it before exactly, but because it triggered something very old in his predator's brain. A warning from deep instinct that said, "This is not prey assessing threat. This is threat assessing threat. I've been asked to let you know," she said, with the careful politeness of someone managing a situation rather than reacting to it, that you're currently being observed by approximately 40 military assets, most of which are airborne and none of which are visible to you. This isn't a threat, it's transparency. We'd prefer to start this conversation honestly. Threk Vol looked at the sky. He could see nothing. His senses detected nothing. His ship's passive sensors, which could track a dust mote in vacuum, registered nothing where she was indicating. He looked back at her. She had the expression of someone waiting to see if the transparency would be appreciated. Slowly, with the deliberateness of a being recalibrating every assumption it had arrived with, Threk Vol lowered his display posture. Not in submission. In reassessment. Your species, he said carefully. You were prey once. Technically, Priya said, everything was prey once. That's how evolution works. You do not behave as prey. She looked up at him, this small, unarmored, bilaterally symmetrical creature on her two ridiculous legs, and something passed across her face that Threk Vol would later describe to the Council as the most unsettling expression he had encountered in 4 decades of planetary acquisition. No, she agreed, we don't. The Vreth High Hunter Council received Threk Vol's preliminary report 14 hours after first contact, and their response was, predictably, laughter. Not the polite, diplomatic kind of laughter. The genuine, resonant, chest-deep laughter of beings who had never once in 11,000 years encountered a situation they could not resolve through superior physicality. The council chamber, a vast, deliberately intimidating space carved from the bones of the first world the Vreth had ever claimed, echoed with it. Grand Hunter Sreva Kal, the eldest member of the council, and a being who had personally overseen the acquisition of 19 systems, laughed so hard that his secondary mandibles cramped. They told you, Sreva Kal managed, between what could only be described as wheezing, that they were watching you, with weapons, that you could not detect. That is correct, Threk Vol said through the communication link, with the flat tone of someone who had moved past embarrassment into a quieter, more serious place. And you believed them. I had no evidence to disbelieve them. Threk Vol. Sreva Kal composed himself with the practiced dignity of a being who had been terrifying things for most of a century. They are small, they are soft, they have no natural weapons beyond flat teeth and blunt fingers. Their world has been divided against itself for the entirety of their recorded history. You are telling me that this species, this squabbling, unarmored, perpetually self-destructive species, has you concerned. I am telling you, Threk Vol said carefully, that Drevon's biological analysis warrants review before we proceed. Send us the analysis. Proceed with acquisition protocol. The council is adjourned. They were still laughing when Drevon's report arrived. They stopped laughing somewhere around page 47, which was the section titled Persistence Hunting and Cognitive Adaptation, a 300,000-year case study in overcoming physical disadvantage through psychological endurance. By page 63, Weapons Development Cycle, from sharpened stone to thermonuclear device, in approximately 10,000 years, the chamber had gone very quiet. By the appendix, which contained a brief summary of something the humans called their 20th century, Grand Hunter Sreva Kal had stopped moving entirely, in the particular stillness of a predator that has just realized it may have misjudged the terrain. He sent a new message to Threk Val. Do not provoke them. This message arrived approximately 3 hours too late. The provocation had not been intentional, which somehow made it worse. Junior Hunter Voss Kran, 22 years old, on his first acquisition mission, possessed of the overconfidence that 22 years of being Vreth generates naturally, had decided that the human's lack of visible fear was a performance, a bluff. He had, without clearing it with Threkval, taken a shuttle to a secondary settlement some distance from the primary contact site, landed in the middle of what the humans called a highway, and deployed in full display posture. He had wanted, in his own words later, to see what humans looked like when they actually understood what they were dealing with. What he saw was a truck driver named Bogdan Lewandowski Price, 54 years old, who had been hauling freight for 26 years, who had driven through 3 blizzards, 2 floods, and 1 incident involving a herd of escaped cattle that he still refused to discuss in detail, and who looked at the 8-limbed armored alien standing in the middle of his highway and made an immediate practical assessment. He stopped the truck. He got out. He put his hands on his hips. "You need to move," Bogdan said. "I've got a delivery." Voss Kran deployed his pheromones at maximum output, the biological signal that told every prey brain in chemical range that it was in the presence of something at the absolute top of every food chain that had ever existed. Bogdan's eyes watered slightly. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his nose. "That's a hell of a smell," he acknowledged. "I'm serious about the delivery, though. Move." Voss Kran made the sound, the deep subsonic vibration that liquefied the courage of lesser species, and took 1 step forward, full plating extended, all 4 secondary limbs raised in the display that said, in every biological language the Vreth had ever encountered, "Run." Bogdan did not run. Bogdan pulled out his phone, took a photograph, and sent it to his daughter with the caption, "You're not going to believe today," before looking back up. "Last chance," he said pleasantly. "I don't want any trouble, but I also don't get paid if this load doesn't arrive." Voss Kran, utterly baffled by the failure of every tool in his biological arsenal, reached out one of his secondary limbs and placed it on the truck, not aggressively, more in the way of emphasis, and felt, immediately, an extremely undignified thing happen. The truck horn, activated by the pressure on the steering wheel, went off directly behind him with a sound like the end of a smaller world, and Voss Kran, who had never in his life been startled by prey, leaped sideways with an involuntary vocalization that he would spend years trying to forget. The video, captured by 3 separate passing drivers, was on what the humans called the internet within 40 minutes. It had been viewed 9 million times by the end of the day. The comment that got the most engagement read, "Bro jumped Lamo." Threkval found out about this incident and the video simultaneously through a communication from Lieutenant Mathur, who had the expression of someone trying very hard to be diplomatic about something that was making diplomatic expression extremely difficult. "So," she said, "one of your people is in Bratislava." "Yes. He seems fine. Nobody's hurt him. We've got local police keeping a perimeter, and someone brought him a sandwich, which he didn't eat, but the gesture was very human of them. We need to get him back to your main group, though, because the media situation is becoming complex." "The media situation," Threkval repeated. "Every news organization on the planet is currently aware that there are aliens on Earth. which means we're now working against a clock because public opinion is going to start mattering very quickly. And right now, the dominant narrative is," she glanced at something off-screen, "the video of your officer jumping away from a truck horn, which is trending globally under several different hashtags, the most popular of which I'm going to decline to translate." Threk Val absorbed this in silence. "Here is what I want you to understand," Priya continued, and her voice shifted, not harder exactly, but more precise, like something being carefully aimed. "We are not a unified species with a single government. You are not going to negotiate a surrender with one authority, because no such authority exists. What you are going to encounter, if you push this, is 8 billion individual human opinions about what to do about you, filtered through several hundred governments, expressed through the most sophisticated information network in our history, and backed by a military-industrial complex that has been in continuous competitive development for roughly 5,000 years. She let that settle. We have been fighting each other for that entire time. We are very good at it. And nothing unifies humans," she added, with an expression that contained something almost like regret, like an external threat. The silence from Threk Val's end lasted long enough that Priya checked her connection. "Commander, I am considering," he said, "what you have said. Take your time." He was, in fact, doing something that Vreth commanders almost never did, because their tactical situations almost never required it. He was consulting Drev-On in real time, asking his xenobiologist to walk him through what would actually happen if the Vreth attempted a standard acquisition on this world. Drev-On walked him through it with the calm thoroughness of someone who had been trying to have this conversation for 2 days. Acquisition protocol assumed a period of initial intimidation, already failed. It assumed resistance would collapse under demonstration of physical superiority. But the humans' history suggested that physical losses did not produce collapse, they produced adaptation. Every weapon the Vreth would deploy, Drev-On explained, with the resigned tone of a scientist delivering unwelcome results, would be reverse-engineered, countered, or improved upon, within a time frame that the Vreth's own weapons development history would have considered implausible. The humans had gone from seeing an aircraft for the first time to putting one in orbit in 66 years. They had a verified, documented tendency to look at technology that defeated them and respond by building better technology, not by surrendering. And, Drev-On added, there is the endurance factor. Explain. The Vreth have never fought a prolonged engagement. We have never needed to. Our acquisition operations last, at most, weeks, against a species that responds to defeat by intensifying effort rather than capitulating. A prolonged engagement becomes, he chose his next word carefully, a test of a different kind of strength. You are saying we might not win. I am saying, Drev-On said, that the mathematical models produce very inconsistent outcomes, which is itself information. Because our models have never produced inconsistent outcomes before. On the surface, Priya Mathur was waiting with the patience of someone who had spent a career waiting for decisions to come down chains of command. Sergeant Kowalczyk had brought her coffee. Yuande was running a secondary communication line to Geneva. Haruto had, somehow, obtained what appeared to be a folding chair and was sitting 20 meters from the alien spacecraft reading a book, which Threk Val's long-range optical sensors confirmed was a history of the Second World War, and which Drev-On noted, quietly, to himself, was almost certainly not a coincidence. Threk Val came back on the line. Lieutenant Mathur, I wish to propose a different kind of conversation. I'm listening. Not acquisition, not surrender. Something your species and mine have apparently not previously attempted. What's that? Negotiation between equals. He paused. Or what I am now prepared to consider, for the first time in my career, may be equals. Priya set down her coffee. Now we're talking. The formal contact proceedings lasted 11 days. They were conducted, at the Vreth delegation's request, though they would never formally admit why, in a brightly lit, open-air location where no corners or shadows existed. Threk Vol had found, in his tactical reassessment, that he preferred to be able to see everything around him when dealing with humans. It was not fear, it was professional respect for an opponent's capabilities, which was an entirely different and much more dignified thing. Grand Hunter Srevakal attended via communication link for the final session, having reviewed Drevon's complete report 3 times and arrived at conclusions that had required significant adjustment to his understanding of the galaxy. He looked at Lieutenant Mathur, shortly to be Ambassador Mathur, as her species reshuffled its command structure around the new reality with impressive speed, and he said, with the formality of a being choosing its words from a vocabulary that had never previously needed these words, "The Vreth acknowledge that this world is not available for acquisition." "Appreciated," Priya said. "We have a question," Srevakal continued, with something in his voice that Threk Val, who had served under him for decades, had never once heard before. "Your species has records of how you survived, how you continued, how you—" He searched for the right formulation, persisted, when persistence should not have been possible. "We do," Priya said. "The Vreth," Srevakal said carefully, "would be interested in access to those records." Priya looked at him. Behind her, Yuande and Haruto exchanged a glance. Even Bogdan Lewandowski Price, who had been brought to the proceedings as something between a witness and a symbol, and who still had 3 outstanding freight deliveries he was anxious to get back to, looked up. "You want to know how we did it," Priya said. "How we survived everything we survived." "The galaxy," Srevakal said, with the weight of 11,000 years of absolute certainty being quietly, carefully revised, "has things in it that are larger than the Vreth." He said this like a being pulling a splinter, quickly, because prolonging it was worse. "We have, perhaps, been fortunate in not encountering them yet. We find that we are now curious about how a species learns to overcome what it cannot overpower." The silence that followed was the comfortable kind. The kind that comes after something true has been said. "We'll need a bigger table," Priya said finally, and somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of human civilization, which had spent its entire recorded history fighting, adapting, losing, rebuilding, and refusing with a stubbornness that defied every reasonable expectation to accept that any situation was permanent or any opponent was insurmountable, the gears began to turn. The Vreth had laughed first. The hunt, as it turned out, had only just begun, and for the first time in 11,000 years, the Vreth were not sure they were the ones doing the hunting. They weren't. They never had been.